There's a moment, and I've seen it maybe a dozen times in my career, where the air in a room changes. Not the temperature, not the pressure readings on the environmental panels, something else, something that doesn't have a name in any of the 17 languages I speak. It's the moment when everyone in that room realizes that what they thought was going to happen isn't going to happen at all. I felt that moment on station, Kareth 9 on a Tuesday morning in the 43rd year of the Galactic Compact. And the person who caused it was a 23-year-old human girl from a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her name was Sergeant First Class Maya Reyes. And none of us, not the Veth commanders, not the Drow observers, not the Saloon diplomats sitting in their temperature-controlled observation booth, none of us saw her coming. Let me back up. Because to understand what happened that day, you need to understand what the combat evaluation wasn't. It wasn't a simple test. It wasn't a fitness assessment or a marksmanship drill or one of those basic multi-species coordination exercises that the Compact ran every rotation to keep the Joint Military Councils feeling productive. No. The Galactic Compact Combat Evaluation, what the soldiers called the GCCE, or sometimes just the Gauntlet, was something else entirely. It was the most prestigious military assessment in known space. 47 species had participated in it since the program began. Only 9 had ever passed it. And when I say passed, I mean any individual from that species had cleared all 7 phases within the time limit. The Saloon had their champion, a 7-foot crystalline warrior named Eshkareth, who still held the record for fastest completion. The Drow had 2 passers. The Veth, the species that designed the Gauntlet, had 11. Humans, 0. Not because humans hadn't tried. They'd sent candidates 3 times before. The first time, 12 years ago, the human military attaché had submitted a team of 6 soldiers. All 6 failed in Phase 3. The second attempt, 8 years ago, 2 candidates, both failing in Phase 4. The third attempt, 4 years ago, 1 candidate, a highly decorated male soldier named Captain David Akaffer, who made it further than any human before him, clearing Phase 5 before the simulation overwhelmed him in Phase 6. He'd been carried out on a stretcher. He'd woken up 3 days later and immediately requested a second attempt, which the Compact had politely declined because you only get 1 shot per candidate. That's the rule. 1 attempt. No do-overs. So when Earth submitted a 4th attempt, the Veth High Council almost didn't accept it. Not out of malice. More out of a kind of tired bureaucratic pity. They'd seen this before. They'd watched humans throw themselves at the gauntlet with total sincerity and total commitment, and they'd watched humans lose. But the Compact required consideration of all member species submissions, so they approved it. And that's how I ended up on Kareth 9, sitting in the observer gallery with my coffee going cold in my hand, watching the registration terminal process the human candidate's credentials. Her name came up on the screen, and I barely registered it. I had 6 other species candidates to observe that cycle. The Torathi were submitting their 4th candidate. The Wren were trying again after a 15-year gap. There was a Veth candidate who was already being called a prodigy in the military press, a young warrior named Vel Saren who'd broken 3 training records and was widely expected to not only pass, but challenge Eshkareth's completion time. The human candidate was, in most people's minds, a formality. Her file said she was 23. It said she was from a place called Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I had to look up because I didn't know where that was, and that she'd served 4 years in something called the United States Army. Her rank was Sergeant First Class, which apparently was mid-tier for human military structure. Not an officer, not a commander, a sergeant. The Veth representative standing next to me in the observer gallery, a tall, silver-scaled officer named Commander Versh, glanced at her file and made a sound that in Veth body language means something like predictable disappointment. Then he turned back to reviewing Velsarin's preparation notes. I kept watching the registration terminal. Maya Reyes. She was standing at the terminal herself, processing her own registration. Most candidates sent an aide or an adjutant to handle the paperwork. She was doing it herself. She was wearing standard human military dress uniform, dark green, simple, with none of the insignia-heavy decorative elements that most species candidates wore to these assessments. She had a regulation braid in her dark hair. She was carrying a single bag over one shoulder. She looked, if I'm being honest, like someone who just arrived for a job interview. Not nervous, not performing confidence, just present. She finished the registration, took her receipt, folded it carefully into her breast pocket, and walked to the waiting area without looking at anyone. I watched her sit down. She opened her bag, took out a water bottle, drank from it, and then pulled out what appeared to be a small, worn notebook and began writing in it. Not reviewing tactical files, not running mental scenarios on a neural display, writing, with what looked like an actual physical pen. The Torathi candidate 3 seats away from her, a hulking, 8-limbed warrior with bioluminescent threat displays running down his carapace, noticed her and stared for a long moment. Then he looked away with the kind of deliberate disinterest that means he'd assessed her and found her irrelevant. I noted that in my observation log. Not because I thought it would matter. Just because that's what I do. My name is Errol Vaughn. I'm a 4th-rank observer with the Galactic Compact's Joint Military Assessment Division. My job is to watch, to record, to write detailed evaluations of what happens during assessments like the GCCE and submit them to the Council with no editorial opinion, no bias, no advocacy. I've been doing this for 22 standard years. I've watched soldiers from 39 different species attempt the gauntlet. I say this not to establish my credentials, but to explain why what I'm about to tell you carries weight. I am, professionally, someone who is not supposed to be impressed by anything. I am not supposed to feel wonder or shock or pride or grief while doing this job. I'm supposed to watch and write and submit. By the end of Maya Reyes' evaluation, I had stopped writing entirely, because I was too busy just watching. The gauntlet runs in 7 phases, each one designed to test something different. Phase 1 is cognitive, a navigation maze through a simulated alien environment with shifting terrain, false exits, and multiple simultaneous threat assessments. The candidate has to reach the extraction point within a set time while identifying and neutralizing 12 hidden threat markers. The environment changes every time. No 2 candidates get the same maze, so you can't memorize your way through it. You have to think. Phase 2 is endurance, a 17-kilometer trek through a simulated hostile planetary environment. The simulation changes every rotation. Sometimes it's desert, sometimes it's deep ocean pressure environments, sometimes it's low-gravity mountain terrain. This cycle, the simulation had been set to dense jungle with a nitrogen-heavy atmosphere that made breathing harder and visibility almost non-existent. Phase 3 is what the soldiers called the room, a confined space combat assessment where the candidate faces a series of escalating combat scenarios against autonomous simulation opponents calibrated to the candidate's own species' physical parameters. The opponents are always harder than they should be. That's the point. Phase 4 is technical. Weapons systems integration, field repair under fire, target acquisition in degraded environments. A lot of candidates who survive Phase 3 fail Phase 4 because they've been thinking about this as a physical test. And suddenly, they're being asked to rebuild a targeting system with 3 components missing, while a simulated artillery barrage plays at full environmental volume around them. Phase 5 is command, a simulated multi-unit engagement where the candidate has to coordinate a mixed-species fire team across a complex urban environment. You're being evaluated not just on the outcome, but on how you communicate, how you handle casualties, how you adapt when the situation doesn't follow the plan, which it never does. Phase 6 is the one that broke Captain Okafor. The compound scenario. I won't describe it in full because the compact keeps the specifics classified. The details change per candidate and per cycle, and revealing them would compromise future assessments. But what I can tell you is that Phase 6 takes everything from the first 5 phases and collapses it into a single sustained scenario that runs between 4 and 8 hours depending on how the candidate performs. There's no break, no pause, no moment where you can step back and breathe and recalibrate. It's designed to reach the limit. Every candidate has a limit. The gauntlet's job is to find it. Phase 7, if you reach Phase 7, is the verdict round. It's the shortest phase, 15 minutes. You stand in front of a VETH assessment panel and they ask you questions, not tactical questions, not weapon specifications or protocol recitations. Personal questions. Questions about why you're here, what you believe, what you fear, what you would sacrifice, and what you wouldn't. The VETH designed the gauntlet and they believe, genuinely, philosophically believe, that a soldier's worth is ultimately determined not by what they can do, but by who they are when there's nothing left to prove. 9 candidates in the history of the program had reached Phase 7. All 9 had passed. If you make it to Phase 7, you pass. That's the practical reality, though it's never been officially stated. You've already proven everything. The verdict round is, in the VETH understanding, just the completion of a conversation that began when you first stepped onto the assessment floor. The assessment for this cycle began at 600 standard. 12 candidates total. The Vel-Saren, the VETH prodigy, registered the fastest Phase 1 completion, 11 minutes, 42 seconds, which was honestly extraordinary. The Torathi candidate came in second. The Ren candidate struggled with the cognitive demands of the maze and made it through at just under the time limit, which meant he was technically cleared but running on borrowed margins from the start. Maya Reyes completed Phase 1 in 14 minutes, 20 seconds. 8th out of 12. In the observer gallery, I watched Versh make a note. 8th, he didn't look concerned. He looked exactly as unconcerned as he'd looked before, which meant he'd already filed the human candidate in the category of not a relevant variable. Phase 2 started at 7:30 after a 30-minute prep interval. The jungle simulation was brutal this cycle. I've watched it run 16 times in different configurations, and this was one of the harsher ones. The heat index was pushed to the upper edge of the survivable range for most species, and the atmospheric composition made every breath feel like you were inhaling through wet cloth. The candidates were separated immediately by the terrain and essentially ran the phase solo, with only their own navigation and endurance to rely on. 2 candidates didn't finish Phase 2. One was the Ren candidate. He hit a respiratory limit about 12 kilometers in, and the medical override kicked in, which is a mercy system the compact built in to prevent fatalities, but it also means automatic disqualification. The other was a Saloon candidate whose crystalline physiology genuinely couldn't handle the temperature differential at the simulation's peak point. Both were recovered by the medical team and released with no lasting harm. The remaining 10 candidates cleared Phase 2. Vel-Saren finished first again. The Torathi second. A Hinvrak candidate, a 6-legged species with extraordinary cardiovascular efficiency, came in third. Maya Reyes finished 6th. Median performance, technically sufficient, not remarkable. She came out of the Phase 2 corridor looking exactly as I expected someone to look after 17 kilometers of simulated jungle, sweat-soaked, breathing hard, hair coming loose from the braid. She accepted water from the station attendant, drank it, poured some over the back of her neck, and then sat on the floor of the staging area with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. I thought she was resting. Then I noticed the notebook was open in her lap. She was writing again. In the middle of the staging area, on the floor, after 17 kilometers of jungle, writing in a notebook. I flagged this in my observation log because it was unusual, not because it seemed significant, just because it was the kind of small detail that can sometimes provide useful context later. I had no idea how useful it would turn out to be. Phase 3 began at 1100. This is where the numbers started to change. The room, the confined combat simulation, runs candidates one at a time in isolated chambers. The observers watch via feed. You can't see the other candidates while they're running. You can only see your own assigned feed. The compact had assigned me to observe the human candidates run. Standard procedure. Each observer is allocated to a specific candidate based on the species assessment rotation. I'd been hoping for Velsarin, but I got Rays. I took my station in front of the feed terminal and brought up her biometric readouts alongside the video. The simulation chamber is a square room, 40 meters per side, with variable architecture, walls that move, ceiling height that shifts, lighting conditions that can go from full illumination to near total darkness in seconds. The opponents, the simulated combatants, are physically modeled on the candidate's own species' peak military parameters. For a human candidate, that meant they were physically approximated to a highly trained human soldier, roughly her height, her weight class, her reach. But they were faster. They had to be. The Veth calibrate the simulation above the candidate's own parameters by a fixed percentage, otherwise it wouldn't test anything. The simulation opponents were fast, faster than a normal human. What they did not account for was the way she moved. I've watched a lot of combat simulations. You develop an eye for it. You learn to read the rhythm of a fight, the way a Veth warrior fights in tight, angular bursts, the way a Drow fighter uses the ground as a lever, always working the low line, the way the Torathi use their extra limbs to create overlapping threat angles that most opponents can't track. I didn't know how to read Maya Rays at first. The first simulation opponent entered from the northern wall at 1103.22. Standard approach pattern, frontal, aggressive, designed to establish early pressure and see how the candidate responds to being rushed. She stepped off the direct line. Not sideways, not backward. Off the line at an angle, and she let the opponent's momentum carry past her. And then she was somewhere else, and the fight had already started differently than the simulation had planned. That's the only way I know how to describe it. The fight started wrong from the simulation's perspective, wrong from any standard tactical analysis. The opponent was designed to win the first exchange. It didn't win the first exchange because there wasn't a first exchange. There was a miss, and then there was a repositioned Maya Rays, and then there was a takedown that ended the first opponent in 11 seconds. 11 seconds. The previous human candidate, Captain Akafar, had taken 44 seconds on the first opponent. His record had been considered fast. I stared at the biometric readouts. Her heart rate was elevated but controlled. Her cortisol markers, stress indicators, were present but not spiking. She wasn't running on panic chemistry. She was running on something flatter, steadier. Like she'd turned down the volume on the part of her brain that generates alarm and turned up the part that just processes information. The second opponent came from the east wall. She hadn't stopped moving from the first takedown. I want you to understand something about elite combat assessment simulation. The opponents are not independent. They coordinate. The Veth programming builds in response logic so that the second opponent accounts for how the first was defeated. If you use a specific technique, the next opponent adapts. She knew this. She had to know this. Every candidate is briefed on the simulation's adaptive logic. What she did was change the technique completely between opponents. First opponent, redirect and takedown, used his momentum, pure Aikido adjacent movement, minimum force. Second opponent, she went straight in, direct, hard. She hit him before he'd finished emerging from the wall panel, and she hit him in a sequence that was almost industrial in its efficiency. 3 strikes, each one setting up the next, no wasted motion, no excess energy, and then it was over and she was already watching the room. Third opponent came from the ceiling. This is a classic Veth psychological disruption, the drop attack. Most candidates see it coming on the biometric tells but still flinch, still lose a half-second of processing time to the startle response. The half-second doesn't sound like much. In simulation combat, it's enormous. She didn't flinch. I watched the video feed very carefully. I watched her eyes on the ceiling sensor display. She had tracked the ceiling panel movement before the opponent dropped. I don't know how. The panel movement is designed to be subtle, a 2-centimeter shift in a room full of moving architecture. She caught it, she read it, and when the drop came, she was already out of the impact zone and the opponent landed on empty floor, and then she was on top of it before it could recover. 15 seconds, third opponent down. The simulation added a fourth opponent. Then a fifth. I looked at the progression counter. She was moving faster through opponents than the simulation had been programmed for. The Compact's assessment system adds opponents based on a timing algorithm that assumes a certain pace of engagement. She was running ahead of the algorithm. The system had to catch up with her. By the time she hit opponent 7, the simulation had escalated to the Phase 3 cap, which is 7 simultaneous opponents. Standard candidates don't reach the simultaneous 7. They usually peak at 3 or 4 at a time, with the others entering sequentially as earlier ones are neutralized. The simultaneous 7 is the theoretical ceiling, included in the code but almost never triggered because you'd have to be processing the room fast enough for the algorithm to throw everything at you at once. She triggered it. 7 opponents all at once. I actually said something out loud at my observation station. I don't know what. I think I called out for the other observers to look at my feed because I needed someone else to confirm that I was reading the numbers correctly. What happened next? What happened in that room with 7 simultaneous simulation opponents? Took 4 minutes and 19 seconds. I've reviewed the recording 47 times since that day. I've shown it to Veth combat analysts. I've shown it to Drow kinetic specialists. I've shown it to 3 separate human military consultants who I tracked down afterward because I needed context. I needed somebody to explain to me what I was looking at. The best explanation I got was from one of the human consultants, a retired officer from a place called Fort Bragg, who watched the footage all the way through in silence and then looked at me and said, "She's not fighting them one at a time. She's fighting the room." "What does that mean?" I asked. He thought about it. She's keeping all 7 in her head simultaneously, not tracking them, keeping them. She knows where all of them are all the time. Most people can track 3 or 4 in a combat space. 7 is, he shook his head. 7 is an architecture problem. You'd have to be mapping the entire room in real time and running predictive models on each opponent simultaneously. The processing load is, he stopped. She trained for this, specifically for this. Not the simulation, she couldn't have known the simulation, but she trained for high-density simultaneous engagement. That's specific. That's targeted. Someone put that skill in her on purpose. He paused. Or she did it to herself. Phase 3 completion time for my arrays, 41 minutes 8 seconds. New record. Not by a narrow margin, by 11 minutes. The previous record had been held by the Veth candidate Vel Saren. He'd completed Phase 3 in 52 minutes, 23 seconds, which had been considered almost impossibly fast. She beat it by 11 minutes. When I got back to the main observer gallery after the Phase 3 feeds closed, the atmosphere had changed. I noticed it immediately. The Torathi observers were talking quietly among themselves and kept looking at the human candidate summary board. The Saloon diplomatic team, who'd been barely paying attention before lunch, had moved closer to the assessment monitoring station. Commander Versh was no longer looking at his notes about Vel Saren. He was standing very still, looking at the Phase 3 completion summary, and the expression on his silver face was something I'd never seen on a Veth face before. It wasn't alarm, it wasn't admiration, it was something more complicated than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had just been shown that a calculation they'd been relying on was wrong. Phase 4 began at 1400 after the mandatory 2-hour rest and nutrition interval. During the break, I went to the candidate rest area standard procedure. Observers are expected to do brief wellness checks during intervals, and I saw Maya Reyes sitting at one of the nutrition stations with a tray of food in front of her. She was eating. Not quickly, not mechanically. Eating with what appeared to be genuine attention, tasting each thing, chewing carefully, taking her time. The notebook was on the table next to her tray. I've been trained not to engage candidates during assessment intervals. It compromises the observation record. You're supposed to observe, not interact. I almost broke that rule. I came very close. Instead, I just noted it, the eating, the notebook, the complete absence of any visible stress in her posture or expression, and returned to the observer station. The Torathi candidate was in the rest area too, on the other side of the room, reviewing tactical feeds on a holographic display with 2 aides who'd been supporting him throughout the day. His threat display was running at low frequency, a sign of alertness that doesn't require full display activation. He was preparing for Phase 4 with everything he had. He didn't make it through Phase 4. The weapons systems integration section broke him, not physically, but procedurally. He made a sequencing error on the field repair component, which cascaded into a targeting failure in the live fire segment, which cost him his time margin. When the time limit hit, he was 14 seconds short. 14 seconds after a full day of extraordinary performance. The Torathi observers were very quiet when the disqualification was announced. Of the 12 original candidates, 7 remained after Phase 4. Vel Saren was still leading on composite score. A Hinvrak candidate, 2 Drow candidates, both exceptional. A Marin warrior I hadn't been tracking closely who had quietly put together a very solid day. A Veth candidate named Reltharn who was considered Vel Saren's closest rival. And Maya Reyes. Still in. Phase 4 completion time, 3rd fastest of the day. Phase 5, the command simulation, ran from 1700 to 2100. 4 hours. This is the phase where I typically see the most variation in performance, because Phase 5 is the most human phase, and I use that word deliberately. Not human as in Homo sapiens. Human as in the way the Veth use the word when they're being philosophical. They believe that how someone leads is the truest expression of who they are. The Gauntlet's Phase 5 is the Veth putting that belief into practice. The simulation gives you a fire team. It gives you a situation, and then it takes the situation apart. Casualties, communication failures, conflicting objectives. Situations where the optimal tactical solution requires you to make a choice that any sane person would find emotionally impossible. Phase 5 has made candidates freeze. It's made them panic. It's made them make exactly the right decision by the numbers and then sit in the aftermath and visibly stop caring about the numbers. The compound isn't Phase 6. What Phase 6 does to candidates physically and cognitively is its own thing. But Phase 5 is where you find out what candidates do when things fall apart and they're responsible for other people. Maya Reyes' fire team simulation started with 6 unit avatars, a mixed species group programmed with distinct behavioral profiles. By the end of the first hour, 3 of them were down, not from enemy engagement. From a structural collapse triggered by a secondary scenario variable that most candidates at this point in the assessment are too depleted to anticipate. She anticipated it. I watched her feed. I watched her redirect 2 of the 3 units before the collapse. The third was unavoidable. The geometry didn't allow a redirect in time, and she knew it. I know she knew it because I watched her face on the biometric cam, and I saw the moment she calculated it, and I saw what the calculation cost her. She didn't freeze. She didn't try to save the unit she couldn't save by sacrificing the one she could. She made the call, she made it clean, and then she moved. The simulation doesn't care about your feelings. The clock doesn't stop because you lost someone. She moved. What she did over the next 3 hours in Phase 5 is something I wrote 17 pages about in my assessment report. I'll try to give you the short version. She talked to her units. That's the part that stood out to me more than anything else. Most candidates treat the Phase 5 units as tactical resources, movable pieces on a board. The units have behavioral profiles that are designed to respond to that kind of treatment in specific ways, which creates a feedback loop. The more you treat them like pieces, the more piece-like they behave, and the harder the simulation gets to navigate. She treated them like people. She gave them information. She told them what she knew, what she didn't know, what she needed from them, and why. When the simulation threw in a conflicting objective scenario, a fork where 2 units needed to go in opposite directions, and you had to choose which priority was higher, she didn't just choose. She explained the choice. She told both units what was happening and why she was deciding what she was deciding, and she asked the one whose route was more dangerous if they understood and if they were ready. The simulation unit responded within its programmed behavioral parameters, with a confirmation signal. But the way it responded was different from how that unit type typically responds to command orders. I checked the baseline parameters later. The unit's confirmation signal carried an engagement metric that was 12% higher than standard command response. 12% in a simulation unit. Because a 23-year-old sergeant from Tulsa, Oklahoma had told it the truth about what it was facing and asked if it was ready. I know that sounds like I'm editorializing. I know that sounds like I'm reading too much into a simulation response metric. I'm aware of that. I'm telling you what the numbers showed. Phase 5 completion. Maya Ray's first place. Best command score in the cycle. By a wide margin. Vel Sarin, who was genuinely extraordinary, who broke records in phases 1, 2, and 3, who was the most hyped Veth candidate in a decade, Vel Sarin finished Phase 5 in 3rd place. His command decisions were tactically excellent. His unit management was textbook. His overall scenario resolution was nearly optimal. But his unit's engagement metrics were 12% lower than hers. When the Phase 5 results posted, the observer gallery had gone very quiet. Commander Versh sat down. I don't know if that sounds significant. Maybe it doesn't, but Versh had been standing for most of the day. He was a Veth officer. They stand during assessment observation as a matter of military formality. He sat down and stared at the results board and didn't say anything for a long time. I need to tell you about the night interval between Phase 5 and Phase 6. Assessments of this scale run over multiple cycles when necessary, but the gauntlet prefers to run phases 1 through 6 in a single continuous cycle. The fatigue is part of the design. Candidates get a mandatory 6-hour rest period before Phase 6. They're given quarters on the station with medical monitoring, proper nutrition, whatever sleep they can manage. This rest period is one of the most important phases of the gauntlet. What you do with 6 hours when you're physically and cognitively depleted, and you know Phase 6 is coming in the morning, tells you a lot. I have access to the rest period environmental monitors. I'm not supposed to use them for invasive observation. There's a specific compact protocol about candidate privacy during rest periods. But the macro data, aggregate wellness metrics, sleep indicators, gross physical activity, That's in my observation file. Valsarran slept 4 hours. 4 hours of solid, continuous sleep. The Veth are extraordinary at sleep regulation. They can compress their recovery period in ways most species can't, getting full cognitive restoration in less time. 4 hours was enough. The Hinvrak candidate slept 6 hours, didn't move. Both Drow candidates, active for 2 hours, then 6 hours unconscious. Maya Rays, 3 hours of what the monitor logged as low activity periods, probably reading or writing. 2 hours unconscious. 45 minutes of what logged as controlled low-intensity physical activity, which from the movement signature looked like stretching or some kind of deliberate breathing exercise. Then another 35 minutes of low activity before the Phase 6 summons. 5 hours and 20 minutes of total downtime, less sleep than the others. Considerably less. She spent part of the night writing in that notebook. I thought about that a lot in the hour before Phase 6 began. What was in the notebook? What was she writing? Was it tactical notes? Letters home? Some kind of personal ritual she developed to manage pre-assessment stress? I never found out what was in the notebook. That wasn't something I had the right to ask. But I think about it still. Phase 6 began at 600 the next morning. The compound scenario. 5 candidates remained. Valsarran, 1 Drow candidate, the second had been medically withdrawn overnight due to a physiological stress response. No lasting harm but automatic disqualification. The Hinvrak. A Marin candidate named Sorval III who'd quietly survived everything and kept their own counsel throughout the entire assessment. And Maya Rays. They were separated for Phase 6. Each candidate runs their own compound scenario, different specifics, same underlying design philosophy. You're isolated. The simulation knows your performance from the previous 5 phases. It uses that knowledge to construct your specific version of Phase 6, targeting your demonstrated strengths and your demonstrated vulnerabilities. In Maya Rays' case, the simulation had observed exceptional physical efficiency, extraordinary spatial awareness, superior command communication, measured emotional engagement, careful nutrition and recovery behavior. It had also observed slightly below median Phase 1 cognitive time, 6th place Phase 2 completion, and this is the one I only understood later. She had paused during Phase 5 at the moment of the casualty. The simulation had flagged it. Just a pause, less than 2 seconds, but a pause is a vulnerability. If you pause, the simulation knows it can make you pause again. The compound scenario for Maya Rays, as I later reviewed from the post-assessment technical disclosure, was built around that pause. The simulation put people at risk. Not tactical units, not abstract assets. Simulated people with rendered faces, with voices, with behavioral profiles sophisticated enough that the distinction between simulated person and real person was, within the immersive environment, almost non-existent. It put those simulated people in impossible situations. Situations where Maya Rays had to make choices between them, where she couldn't save everyone, where the optimal tactical solution required her to sacrifice the few for the many, and the simulation was specifically, deliberately designed to make the few feel real. It ran for 5 hours and 47 minutes. The Hinvrak candidate lasted 3 hours and 12 minutes before the medical override triggered. The Marin candidate, Sorval III, who I'd come to genuinely respect over the course of the assessment, lasted 4 hours, 20 minutes. Their withdrawal was behavioral rather than medical. There's a specific threshold marker in the compound scenario where the simulation's ethical pressure reaches a point that some candidates find psychologically impassable. Sorval III hit that threshold and stopped. They didn't collapse. They didn't have a medical event. They simply stopped and said clearly to the simulation interface, "I cannot make this choice. I decline." That's a valid response, the compact built in the option. Declining is not shameful, it's honest. Sorval III later said, in the post-assessment debrief, that they had decided the scenario was asking them to commit to a moral framework they could not commit to, and they had chosen not to pretend otherwise. I have enormous respect for that. But it meant Sorville 3 was out. Valsarran ran for 5 hours and 11 minutes. He was extraordinary. I want to be clear about that. Valsarran's Phase 6 performance, by every metric the simulation tracked, was the most technically excellent Phase 6 run in the history of the program up to that day. His decision-making under cognitive and emotional pressure was almost superhuman, or rather, almost unhuman, because superhuman implies the human baseline, and Valsarran was operating from a Veth baseline that was genuinely and substantially different. He was precise. He was efficient. He was controlled. He reached the simulation's peak stress threshold, the scenario's final, most extreme pressure state, and he made the correct decision, tactically and strategically, with optimal resource allocation and minimal deviation from protocol. And then something in him hesitated. I don't know what it was. I can't tell you. The biometric record shows a 4-second window where his motor response dropped and his cortisol levels spiked and then renormalized. 4 seconds. In the context of a 5-hour run, 4 seconds is nothing. In the context of the compound scenario's final threshold, 4 seconds is everything. The simulation read the hesitation. It modeled it, and it applied a pressure escalation that was specifically calibrated for that hesitation. It wasn't a different scenario. It was the same scenario made harder by exactly the degree that Valsarran's hesitation had indicated he could be pushed. And he didn't recover from it. He made 3 rapid decisions over the next 6 minutes that were each technically defensible, but collectively created a cascade that the simulation declared a critical failure. 87% scenario resolution, which is extraordinary. Which is a score that would have passed in earlier cycles when the standards were less well-defined. But the current standard for Phase 6 completion is 90%. Valsarran finished at 87. He came out of the simulation chamber and stood in the staging area with absolute composure. He is a Veth warrior. He did not display distress. He stood straight, accepted the result notification from the assessment officer, and then did something I have genuinely never seen a Veth do in a professional assessment context. He asked where the human candidate was. "She's still in," the assessment officer said. Valsarran looked at the duration counter on the status board. My arrays had been in Phase 6 for 5 hours and 42 minutes at that point. 9 minutes longer than Valsarran, still running. He didn't say anything. He went to the observation feed terminal and he stood there and watched.